I'm a 32-year-old guy, and every summer, my family rents a big cabin up in the mountains for our annual family reunion. It's something we've done for as long as I can remember, and it's always been one of those things you look forward to all year. Everyone shows up: siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, and of course grandma. She's the glue that keeps us all together, and this reunion is her favorite tradition. We spend the week hiking, barbecuing, playing board games, and telling the same old stories that somehow never get old. This year was supposed to be like every other. We'd rented a huge cabin with enough space for all 20 or so of us. By the time I arrived on Friday afternoon, most of the family was already there. The cousins were on the deck, passing around drinks and laughing like no time had passed since last summer. The kids were running around in the yard, and inside, the aunts were busy in the kitchen making dinner. It felt like stepping into a warm, familiar bubble. Except this year, Molly wasn't there yet. Molly's my cousin, a year younger than me, and she's always been a bit of a wild card. She's the type to show up late or forget plans entirely, but she's also the one who keeps things interesting. You never really know what Molly's going to say or do, but she's fun, and for the most part, the family loves her for it. By the time dinner rolled around, she still hadn't shown up, which was unusual, even for her. It wasn't until almost 9 p.m., 3 hours late, that we finally heard a car pull up outside. Everyone kind of perked up, waiting to see what Molly's excuse was going to be this time. But when the door opened, Molly didn't come in alone. She walked in with a man. He was tall, maybe mid-50s, wearing a button-up shirt and jeans that looked just a little too new, like he was trying hard to make a good impression. Molly introduced him as Uncle Charlie and said he was our dad's half-brother, someone she'd recently reconnected with. That's when the room went dead quiet. Now, I should explain something. Our family isn't one of those big, sprawling families where people lose touch. We're tight-knit. We know each other's stories, histories, and even the weird little quirks. So the idea that our dad had some secret half-brother none of us had ever heard about, it didn't sit right. I could feel my siblings exchanging glances from across the room, and even Grandma, who's usually the first to welcome anyone, looked completely thrown. Someone asked Charlie a couple of polite questions, trying to ease the awkwardness. Where was he from? How long had he known about us? His answers were vague. He said he'd been around but didn't go into details. He didn't mention how he and Molly had reconnected, just that it was serendipity. When Grandma pressed him, asking how he was related to her late husband, he dodged the question with a laugh and a shrug. The whole thing felt off. But Molly jumped in, defending him before anyone could push further. She said she'd found an old photo of Charlie as a kid, standing next to our grandfather, and that he'd even been mentioned in one of Grandpa's journals. She seemed genuinely excited, like she'd uncovered some big family secret and was thrilled to share it. When someone asked where the journal was, Molly casually mentioned she'd left it at home, not thinking she'd need it. That's when things started to divide. Half the family tried to be polite, saying we should give Charlie a chance. The other half, including my siblings and me, were more skeptical. We didn't say much out loud, but you could feel it in the room. It wasn't just the lack of proof, it was the way Charlie carried himself. He seemed too eager to charm us, too quick to brush off any tough questions. And when Grandma, who's got a memory like a steel trap, said she'd never heard of him, that sealed it for me. Something was off. Molly, of course, noticed the tension. She got defensive, accusing everyone of being cold and unwelcoming. She pulled out her phone and showed us the photo again, the same crumpled picture she'd already shown when they walked in. It was hard to argue with the photo. The man standing next to Grandpa did look like a younger version of Charlie. But still, it didn't explain why none of us had ever heard about him before. After dinner, while everyone was cleaning up, I pulled out my phone and started doing a little digging. I Googled Charlie Grandpa's last name and variations of it, but nothing came up. No Facebook profile, no obituaries mentioning him as a relative, nothing. It didn't prove anything, but it also didn't help his case. By the end of the night, most of the family had retreated to their rooms, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling in my gut. If Charlie really was who he said he was, why did it feel like we were all being played? I had a bad feeling this reunion was about to take a turn none of us would forget. Update 1. The evening didn't end quietly. After dinner, once Molly and Charlie had gone off to the patio, a group of us decided to have a quick meeting in the living room. The tension in the room was thick as everyone whispered about what had just happened. Grandma sat in her usual spot on the recliner, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak much, but you could tell she was bothered by the whole situation. One of my uncles was the first to bring up what everyone was thinking. He pointed out Molly's history, how she had a habit of getting caught up in elaborate stories or half-truths. It wasn't that she was a bad person, but she was known for being a little impulsive and dramatic. A cousin chimed in, reminding everyone about the time Molly claimed she was starting a business that turned out to be a short-lived side hustle she'd exaggerated to sound like a huge deal. As we were hashing this out, the sound of the sliding door opening made everyone freeze. Molly had overheard us. She walked into the room, her face red, and started accusing us of being unfair and judgmental. Her voice was loud enough to bring Charlie back inside. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Molly wasn't backing down, saying she'd gone out of her way to bring Charlie here, and that we weren't even giving him a chance. At that point, Charlie stepped in. He started talking about how he'd spent years wondering about his family and how meeting Molly had been a blessing. He said he just wanted to connect with us and share in the reunion. His speech was emotional. He even got a little choked up, but something about it felt rehearsed. He mentioned a family gathering from years ago but got the year wrong. Then he referred to Grandma's late husband, our grandfather, by a nickname nobody had ever used. The inconsistencies weren't lost on Grandma. She sat quietly until Charlie finished, then calmly said she didn't believe him. She reminded everyone that she'd been married to Grandpa for over 50 years and would have known if he had another child. Her voice was steady, but you could tell she was holding back her frustration. Someone else suggested we do a DNA test to clear everything up. It wasn't an unreasonable idea, but Molly immediately shot it down. She said it was insulting, that we didn't need science to prove family bonds. Charlie agreed, saying he didn't need a test to know where he belonged. That only made things worse. One of my aunts asked why they wouldn't want to confirm the truth if they were so sure. Molly didn't answer. Instead, she gave an ultimatum. If we kept questioning Charlie, they'd leave. The room was silent after that, but things weren't over. Another uncle brought up an old rumor about Grandpa. It was something that had been whispered about years ago, that he might have had an affair. It wasn't a secret, but it had never been proven. Molly jumped on that, saying it was obvious the rumor was true and Charlie was the proof. Grandma shook her head and said she didn't believe it. As the argument continued, I couldn't help but notice Charlie fidgeting with his phone. He was checking it often, almost nervously, like he was waiting for something. At one point, he muttered something to Molly, and she nodded, her jaw tight. The whole thing felt strange, and my suspicion only grew when Charlie slipped up and called Grandma by the wrong name. He corrected himself quickly, but the damage was done. My siblings noticed it too, exchanging quick glances across the room. Later, after things had calmed down a bit, I decided to keep digging. I sat on the stairs, scrolling through my phone, trying to find anything about this guy. After a few tries, I found a social media profile for someone with Charlie's name. The profile wasn't private, and as I scrolled through the pictures, my stomach sank. There were photos of Charlie at different events, smiling with other people, none of whom looked even remotely related to us. One picture had him tagged at a wedding, and the caption mentioned a completely different last name. I shared the profile with my siblings, and we all agreed it didn't add up. The more we pieced things together, the more Molly's behavior started to make sense. She was agitated, not just because we were questioning her, but because, deep down, she probably knew something wasn't right. As the night went on, she became more withdrawn, barely speaking to anyone except Charlie. By the time everyone went to bed, I was sure of one thing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a case of bad communication. There was something bigger going on. Molly might have been fooled, or maybe she was in on it, but either way, Charlie wasn't who he claimed to be. As I stared at the ceiling that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something was going to give, and when it did, it wasn't going to be pretty. For now, all I could do was wait and see how it all played out. Update 2. The next morning, I decided to confront Molly privately. She was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring off at the trees. I stepped outside and sat down next to her. I kept my tone calm, asking her why she was so defensive about Charlie when so many things about him didn't add up. Instead of answering, Molly immediately went on the defensive. She accused me of being the one trying to ruin the reunion. She said the family had always been judgmental, and that no one ever gave her the benefit of the doubt. She refused to talk about Charlie, dodging every question I tried to ask, and eventually stormed off before I could get any real answers. Later that night, things took a strange turn. One of my cousins, who had gotten up to grab a drink from the kitchen, saw Charlie snooping around in one of the bedrooms. It wasn't just any room, it was the one where Grandma kept some of her more valuable things, like jewelry and old family keepsakes. My cousin confronted him right then and there. Charlie claimed he was just looking for the bathroom, but it didn't make sense. The bathroom was on the opposite side of the house, and everyone knew it. The next morning, word of what happened spread quickly, and tensions boiled over during breakfast. Molly accused everyone of treating her and Charlie like criminals, saying we were just looking for reasons to push them away. It turned into a full-blown argument, with people raising their voices and pointing fingers. Grandma, who had been trying to stay neutral, finally had enough. She stood up, looked Charlie straight in the eye, and told him to leave. She said she didn't believe his story and wasn't going to let him stay in her home if he couldn't prove who he was. Charlie didn't take it well. He snapped at Grandma, raising his voice in a way that shocked everyone. The room went silent for a moment before Molly jumped in to defend him again. She admitted that she'd only met Charlie a few months ago, but she insisted he was telling the truth. She said he'd shown her the old photo of Grandpa, and that was enough for her to believe him. That's when I brought up the possibility that Charlie might be using her. Molly's face twisted into a mix of anger and hurt, and it set off another round of arguments. People were taking sides now. Some thought we should let Charlie stay until we could figure everything out, while others were ready to pack his bags and send him on his way. To settle it, someone suggested we take a vote. Surprisingly, one of my uncles, who'd been quiet through most of the drama, voted in favor of letting Charlie stay. He said, "What if he's telling the truth? We don't want to regret pushing him away." That swung a few more votes in Charlie's favor, and it was decided he could stay, at least for now. But then another twist. Later that afternoon, one of my cousins noticed their watch was missing. It wasn't just any watch, it was an expensive one they'd gotten as a graduation gift. At first, they thought they might have misplaced it, but after what had happened the night before, suspicions immediately turned to Charlie. Molly got wind of this and exploded. She accused everyone of being paranoid and making baseless accusations against Charlie because they didn't like him. She even threatened to call the police if anyone tried to go through Charlie's things. The tension hit its breaking point when someone actually suggested searching Charlie's room. Molly stood in front of the door, daring anyone to try. She was on the verge of tears, shouting about how everyone was treating her like an outsider. It was the most upset I'd ever seen her. At that moment, it felt like the entire family was unraveling. We all backed off for the time being, but it was clear this couldn't go on much longer. Charlie stayed holed up in his room for the rest of the evening, barely coming out. Molly stayed close to him, glaring at anyone who even looked in their direction. I spent the rest of the night trying to figure out what to do. The pieces weren't adding up, but without hard evidence, there was no way to prove Charlie wasn't who he said he was. At the same time, the longer this dragged on, the more it felt like we were losing Molly. It was a ticking time bomb. We were either about to find out the truth, or lose Molly for good. Update 3. The morning after the argument about searching Charlie's room, things went from bad to worse. Over breakfast, someone casually asked Charlie if he'd let us take a quick look at his belongings, just to clear the air and end the accusations. Charlie immediately shut it down. He said it was a violation of his privacy and accused everyone of treating him like a criminal. Molly backed him up, saying the family had crossed the line. The tension in the room was suffocating. That's when Molly followed through on her earlier threat. She stormed off, phone in hand, and made a call. Within an hour, 2 police officers arrived at the cabin. It was surreal watching them walk up the porch. Molly greeted them at the door, talking fast and gesturing toward the rest of us. She claimed that she and Charlie were being harassed and that the family was trying to intimidate them. The officers sat everyone down and listened to both sides. It was awkward explaining the situation, how we were suspicious of Charlie and wanted to verify his story. They kept a neutral tone, telling us this was a civil matter and not something they could get involved in. They suggested we all cool down and try to resolve things like adults. Before leaving, one of the officers gave a pointed reminder that calling them again for a non-emergency might not go over well. Molly smirked as they walked out, looking like she thought she'd won. But the situation wasn't over. After the officers left, Grandma pulled me aside. Her voice was low and she glanced around to make sure no one was listening. She told me there was something she needed to share. Apparently there was a child born out of wedlock, an affair my grandfather had kept hidden from almost everyone. But Grandma was adamant this had nothing to do with Charlie. She said the child, a girl, had been given up for adoption years before Charlie could have been born. Unfortunately, Molly overheard part of the conversation. She burst into the room, accusing Grandma of lying to cover up the truth. She was shaking as she insisted Charlie must be the secret child. Grandma stayed calm, saying she had proof. She went to her room and came back with a small bundle of old letters. They were from the woman Grandpa had an affair with, confirming the timeline and the adoption details. The child would have been well into her 60s by now, far too old to be Charlie. Molly didn't want to hear it. She snatched the letters, scanned through them, and then tossed them on the table, saying they didn't prove anything. At this point, Charlie was nowhere to be found. Someone asked where he was, and Molly said he had gone outside to get some air. We didn't think much of it until one of my cousins looked out the window and noticed him sitting in Molly's car. His head was down, and he seemed to be rifling through something. A few of us went outside to check, but by the time we got there, he had stepped out of the car and was holding a folder under his arm. When we asked what he was doing, he shrugged and said he'd been looking for something Molly left behind. One of my uncles caught a glimpse of the papers before Charlie shoved them back into the folder. They weren't random notes or keepsakes, they looked like financial documents. That set off alarm bells. When we asked Molly about it, she seemed genuinely confused. It was the first time she looked unsure about Charlie, her confidence in him wavering. Things came to a head later that evening. I couldn't hold back anymore and confronted Charlie in front of everyone. I accused him outright of trying to con us. The room went silent as I laid out everything. The inconsistencies in his story, the suspicious behavior, the fact that Molly only met him a few months ago. Molly immediately jumped to his defense, shouting that I was out to humiliate her. Before things could escalate further, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, and for some reason I felt compelled to answer. A man's voice came through the line. He said he'd seen a post on social media about a family reunion and recognized Charlie in one of the photos. He claimed Charlie had pulled a similar stunt before, pretending to be a long-lost relative to gain access to family events. According to the caller, Charlie was a known scam artist who used fake stories to exploit people's emotions, and sometimes their bank accounts. I thanked the man and hung up, my heart racing. I knew we finally had the evidence we needed, but convincing Molly? That was going to be the real challenge. As I looked across the room at her, still standing protectively next to Charlie, I couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever believe us before it was too late. Update 4. That night, after the call exposing Charlie's scam history, my siblings and I decided to dig deeper. We spent hours online, searching for any records or mentions of him. It didn't take long to find multiple articles and forum posts. Each one painted the same picture. Charlie had been targeting grieving or estranged families for years, pretending to be a long-lost relative to gain access to their homes and finances. There were stories of him claiming to be a son, brother, or cousin, spinning convincing tales, and walking away with cash, valuables, and sometimes even stolen identities. The more we read, the worse it got. One post from a few years back mentioned him getting caught at a family gathering with fake bank statements and forged legal documents. Another talked about how he'd conned an elderly woman into giving him access to her savings account, claiming he needed it to settle a family estate. It was horrifying to think this man was now sitting in our cabin, pretending to be one of us. By morning, some of the others in the family had joined us, and the mood around the breakfast table was tense. Molly and Charlie showed up late, and it was clear Molly had noticed the shift in how people were treating them. Charlie seemed unfazed, but Molly looked uncomfortable. She kept glancing at him, as if trying to read his reactions. For the first time, it felt like she was starting to have doubts. Then, a bombshell dropped. One of my uncles went to retrieve something from a drawer in the main bedroom, the same drawer Charlie had been caught near 2 nights earlier. Inside, he found checks and bank statements that didn't belong to him. It wasn't obvious at first why they were there, but a closer look revealed they were Grandma's. They had clearly been moved, and there was even one blank check missing. That was enough to convince most of the family that Charlie was up to something. When Molly walked in and saw the group crowded around the documents, she froze. We didn't hold back this time. We laid out everything we'd found, the missing check, the financial papers in his possession, and the posts we'd uncovered about his history. Molly's face went pale, but instead of admitting we might be right, she doubled down. She said Charlie would never do anything like that and accused us of ganging up on him to drive him away. She even claimed we'd planted the evidence to make him look bad. As the argument escalated, someone glanced out the window and saw Charlie heading toward his car with a duffel bag. A few of us rushed outside and caught him just as he was opening the trunk. Inside the bag were several of Grandma's documents, including the missing check, along with some other papers we didn't immediately recognize. That was the last straw. Someone called the police. The officers arrived quickly this time, and the mood was completely different from their first visit. We showed them the evidence, and after a short conversation, they detained Charlie. Molly was hysterical, screaming at everyone for humiliating her and Charlie. She kept insisting he was innocent, but the proof was undeniable. As the police questioned him, Charlie finally cracked. He admitted to being a fraud, confessing that he'd targeted our family because he thought it would be easy to win Molly over. To his credit, he claimed Molly hadn't been involved in the scam, saying she genuinely believed his story. That small bit of truth seemed to crush her even more. When the police drove Charlie away, Molly broke down completely. She alternated between crying and yelling at us, accusing the family of pushing her into a corner and ruining her chance at something good. It was hard to watch, especially when it was clear she was also furious at herself for being fooled. Grandma was the one who stepped in to comfort her. She didn't say much, just pulled Molly into a hug and let her cry it out. Later, Grandma told everyone that it was important to forgive Molly and move on. She said we all make mistakes, and this was hers to learn from. In the aftermath, I suggested the family consider therapy. The whole thing had left a huge rift, and it wasn't something we could just sweep under the rug. Molly agreed to it eventually, though it was clear she was still struggling with the embarrassment and betrayal. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far things went before the truth came out. Molly might have been fooled, but the damage Charlie left behind was very real. It's going to take time for everyone to heal, but at least we're finally moving in the right direction. Update 5. The reunion didn't end on a happy note. After everything with Charlie, the family decided to cut it short. Nobody said it outright, but the energy was completely drained. People started packing up early, and by midday, cars were pulling out of the driveway. Grandma stood on the porch as everyone left, looking tired but resolute. She hugged each of us tightly, telling us to take care of each other. A few weeks later, we got word about Charlie. He pleaded guilty to fraud and was sentenced to a short prison term for theft and attempted identity fraud. It wasn't a long sentence, but it was enough to give us some closure. Still, the damage he caused to our family wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. Molly disappeared after the reunion. She didn't answer texts or calls, and it was clear she needed time. A few family members were angry with her for bringing Charlie into our lives, but most of us just felt sad. She'd been duped, yes, but she was also embarrassed and ashamed. She'd believed in Charlie so deeply, and now she was the one left to deal with the fallout. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake a sense of guilt. I'd been one of the loudest voices calling out Charlie, and while I knew it had to be done, it still felt heavy. I thought about how things might have gone differently if we'd approached Molly with more understanding. Grandma must have sensed this because one day, while I was helping her in her garden, she started talking about the real estranged child. Grandma had always been good at holding the family's secrets, but now she seemed ready to let them out. She told me about the letters, how Grandpa had struggled with the guilt of giving up a child, and how she'd always wondered if they'd reconnect someday. Sharing these stories seemed to help her process everything. And in a way, it helped me too. It reminded me that our family's history was complicated, but that didn't mean we couldn't move forward. Over the next few months, my siblings and I made a point of checking on Molly. She still wasn't talking to most of the family, but little by little, she started responding to our messages. She wasn't the same Molly we'd grown up with. She seemed quieter, like she was carrying a weight she couldn't put down, but she was trying. Then, one day out of the blue, I got a text from her. It was short and direct. "I'm sorry for not listening. I was wrong, and I feel lost." I didn't push her for more. I just let her know I was there if she needed me. That was the start of something new. A few weeks later, we organized a smaller family gathering. It wasn't the big, rowdy reunion we usually had, just a handful of us at Grandma's house. Molly came, and while things were awkward at first, it felt good to see her. We spent the day talking openly about everything that had happened. There were tears, apologies, and even a few laughs as we reflected on the chaos Charlie had brought into our lives. Eventually, some of us decided to attend therapy. It wasn't just for what had happened with Charlie, but also to address some of the underlying issues in our family. Molly joined us a few sessions in, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were all working towards something positive. One evening after therapy, Molly and I had a long conversation. She opened up about how desperate she'd been to find a connection, to feel like she belonged. Charlie had come along at a time when she felt invisible, and he'd made her feel important. It didn't excuse what had happened, but it helped me understand why she'd clung to him so fiercely. Grandma's wisdom tied everything together. At another small gathering, she reminded us that forgiveness was key to keeping our family strong. She told us we needed to stay cautious in the future, but that holding grudges would only hurt us more. Her words seemed to resonate with everyone, especially Molly. In the end, the whole experience brought us closer. We became more honest with each other, more supportive. Molly started making changes in her life, taking steps to rebuild her confidence and trust in herself. She even joked that she'd make a better judge of character from now on. Then, just when we thought things had settled, Grandma dropped another surprise. She'd received a letter from the real estranged child, now an older woman, who wanted to reconnect. The timing felt almost poetic, like life was giving us a chance to heal the right way. In the end, Charlie's scam may have hurt us, but it also forced us to confront things we'd been ignoring for years. It brought us closer, made us stronger, and reminded us of what really matters. We'll never let something like this tear us apart again.